Okay, let me just start. Okay, so given that all of this has been taken care of, without further ado, debating the motion, this House regrets the criminal justice reform movement's focus on non-violent drug offenders in the United States. We now welcome the Prime Minister. Here.
Hi, again, POIs in the chat. If it doesn't look like I'm going to get to it just verbally around the 5-minute mark. Okay, hold on. Grab my timer real quick. I apologize. All right, starting now. Right now, as the info slide discusses, the majority of people in jail are currently not violent drug offenders. We believe that the reason of the criminal justice reform movement focuses on this non-violent drug offenders is very simple. This is the lowest hanging fruit. It's the easiest advocacy to take on. It's the easiest thing for the general public to latch onto. Every single Democrat and the vast majority of independents, even many Republicans, are extremely cognizant of the fact that the war on drugs was a complete and utter failure. As a result, a fair few incentives align on this issue, and Democrats and Republicans alike can score easy wins by, for example, Biden pardoning a massive amount of federal sentences for marijuana in 2022, even though this let 0 people actually out of federal prison because they were additionally sentenced for much more serious crimes. The problem that this is entirely false sovereignty because it doesn't actually account for what makes the United States criminal justice system so insidious. It is a well-known fact that U.S. prisons are akin to modern-day slavery, depriving prisoners of basic human rights such as access to their families, their children, and meals that are nutritionally insufficient, and forcing prisoners to earn far below minimum wage for coerced labor in order to purchase basic necessities such as food and hygiene products such as toothbrushes and tampons that the state literally refuses to provide for free. These egregious human rights abuses not only successfully swept under the rug because of this lack of sympathy that American society has for the prison population. The truth is that, yes, a majority of prisoners are serving time for violent offenses like assault, burglary, robbery because of the dire conditions in American urban centers that force impoverished people towards crime. If you're found with drugs in your trunk, sentences at this point are extremely minimal because we've already made it clear that a vast majority of progress on lowering possession of marijuana, crack and cocaine, and opiate sentences in the status quo. These issues affect all demographics, and that's why the push to treat addiction as a disease has already been a success. This is already happening. It's not really an issue anymore. There are so many other issues currently facing the justice systems that we are currently describing. The problem is that America has still made virtually no progress in alleviating oppression against both prisoners as well as against Black and brown bodies as a whole. We provide a model to solve. Instead of focusing on nonviolent drug offenders, we need to shift America's perception of justice away from the retributive justice and toward restorative justice. This looks like a campaign for basic human rights for prisoners, campaigning for better in-prison education systems, such as widening the ability to not only get GEDs, but higher education, the rights to vote for prisoners, and most importantly, the rights to fair wages and compensation for prison labor. The bar is literally on the floor just because of how poorly we treat our prisoners in the United States, considering the fact that we already have overcrowding in prisons, we have underfunded prisons, we don't have any more room for individuals, so we need to start at the source. We need to humanize all prisoners, not just non-violent offenders, in order to get any actual structural change within prison. If we continue to allow the narrative to revolve around easy bipartisan wins and fake change that has no more solvency left to provide, we are doing a massive disservice to the nearly 2 million people behind bars in America. This focus on nonviolent drug offenders not only just pulls focus and resources from other serious issues within the criminal justice system, but it actually harms the prisoners further. Issues surrounding violent offenders are complicated and often difficult to unpack. I can take the POI.
You can't just claim a counterfactual that you like. You need to prove why that's likely to happen. The reason why there was an emphasis on drug users was because the war on drugs was a popular topic. The more likely counterfactual is you demonizing drug users. Please defend that.
The fact is that we're not actually demonizing drug users. We're just simply stating that there are other problems that need to be taken care of in order to have the problem of nonviolent drug users as a solution. I mean, it's a ladder of progress, because you can't just slap a band-aid on the entire situation and say you're doing so much for the criminal justice system when it's so completely broken. There's no way to actually create change unless you focus on the actual problems within the justice system. In terms of just nonviolent offenders and pulling attention away from this, we're not trying to demonize drug offenders, but we're trying to humanize other prisoners. There's no harm in shifting the attention away from different minority groups. Often generational racialized issues that exist in the criminal justice system go to exacerbate problems related to crime. People turning to theft and other violent crimes out of necessity, or wrong place, wrong time occurrences, even over-policing in minority neighborhoods, lead to an increase in overcrowding in prisons in different regions, as well as the fact that it just labels and perpetuates different stereotypes that already exist within the criminal justice system. And then putting an emphasis onto nonviolent drug offenders ignores the other systematic issues present within the system. It's easier to ignore the problem, and issues keep arising, and attention needs to be put on this issue. It completely ignores the why of why people are being incarcerated on these charges. As we stated earlier, when Biden passed a proposal to forgive and pardon a massive amount of federal sentences for marijuana in 2022. Again, 0 people actually were let out of federal prison because they were sentenced on much more serious crimes. This is the issue that we're currently proposing needs to be fixed, as opposed to just focusing on these nonviolent drug charges. The rise of social movements in the US show that this is also an issue, but in terms of trying to solve the problem by switching the blame to other issues within the criminal justice system, it's a band-aid to a much larger issue. You're ignoring the bigger picture. The current system of tough on crime policies, over-policing, and focus on smaller, less important issues does not work. In attacking the bigger underlying issues present within the judicial system, you work towards furthering restorative justice. You remove a lot of issues that cause unfair incarceration in the first place, and overall, it's a much better use of time, money, and resources. For these reasons, proud to propose.
We thank the previous speaker for their remarks. We now welcome the leader of opposition. Hear.
Hi, okay, just clarifying one more time. I prefer verbal POIs. And I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. What opening government team needs to realize in this debate is that this is a this House regrets motion, meaning this is a retrospective debate where we are looking backwards at the motion and the effects it has had historically. The point in which they concede that treating addiction right now isn't as much of an issue anymore, and that we've been able to alleviate and help a large majority of people. That is the point in which they concede that this thing as something that's been successful for the movement as a whole. That's why they're counterfactual, where they can now focus on other issues like overcrowded prisons is far better dealt with on our side after we have first dealt with the non-violent drug offenders and can move the focus elsewhere. Moving on to the bulk of their case, which is about how there's other issues largely within status quo, that we shouldn't just focus on violent and non-violent offenders of drugs, but rather we should focus on humanizing all prisoners, like catering to things like how prisons are often underfunded, they lack a lot of quality things. But what they don't prove within their speech, firstly, is sure, maybe humanizing all prisoners is important, we concede that, but they don't prove why that would be a feasible goal for the movement to take on. I think especially note their own characterization that came out within the primary parts of their speech, at the issue of non-violent drug offense was something that already had a lot of democratic support, something that already only backtracks from their own claim as to why their side will also achieve any support on their side. But we would say even if they do achieve some extent of support or have some sort of sympathy, it's unclear how much a movement can actually advocate for. If you're advocating to humanize all different types of prisons, if you're trying to reach for so many different issues at once, then the reach that you actually have is going to be far more shallow in terms of how much you can actually delve into each issue, considering that there's a limited reach and a limited amount of political capital or support that a movement has. So obviously if you're the movement and you advocate for one thing, that decreases the amount of time you can spend advocating for other things, or the amount of public support that is garnered to other issues as well. So it's unclear what their kind of positive push looks like at the end of the day. But we think that lastly, the last point to note here is we actually think that if we can start first on a smaller scope, that's far more successful for the movement as a whole when looking in terms of future like pushes as well, considering that if you're able to get a success first, that also boosts up your own movement's like reputation or the amount of credibility and trust that people see within your own movement. That's why you're seen as far more effective and can push for larger things in the long run. Two arguments then I'm going to forward. Firstly, why is status quo the best in efficiently catering for drug-related cases? But then secondly, why this is something that is principally justified in itself. Firstly, then, why is status quo the best in efficiently caring for drug-related cases? What kind of people often commit nonviolent drug offenses? And there are two stakeholders that we want to characterize. The first are often teenagers or younger adults who are more vulnerable to negative social influences or bad peer pressure, who often lack like an attentive parent figure who can like counter them away from those influences. This is for the mere reason that teens are often almost far more irrational in terms of decision making because their logical thought hasn't been fully developed yet. But the second stakeholder we would characterize to you are often poor or marginalized communities with high crime rates. So these are people who face immense pressure or like economic duress or obstacles on a daily basis, as well as they've been exposed to drugs or substances starting from a young age. That's why they're more desensitized them to like resorting to drugs in the first place. The crucial characterization to note here is neither of these major stakeholders are the ones to actually blame for their arbitrary circumstances that force them into opting into drugs in the first place. What has the movement then been doing? We think that rather we're able to decrease stigma against drug offenders through things like awareness or campaigns, especially those who are victims of environmental factors that make them more susceptible to opting in the first place. We think we also be able to do things like decreasing sentences for non-violent offenders. Note this is proportional based on the changing moral standards. But then lastly, I want to talk about why the comparative of demonizing drug users will be something that is far worse. And the crucial nuance to note here is that if you punish drug offenders heavily within this criminal justice system, you are actively sending a narrative that these are bad people inherently because they make these bad choices, right? The impact then here is twofold. First, you reduce the public support or sympathy that exists for these people, which is crucial for having the political capital or support to do things like building rehabilitation centers or getting support programs in order to help these people regain a healthy track back into their life and be able to reintegrate within society again, crucially. The second impact is that the more social stigma there is around the crime of committing drugs, even if you have rehabilitation centers on both sides of the house, it is far harder to opt into them as a drug user because to go to a rehabilitation center means you're actively acknowledging your faults and like shaming upon yourself, which is why people are far more unlikely or they feel like it is going to be so much harder for them to go to a rehabilitation center in the first place or to be able to get any support, any type of help to begin with. Then the impact then is that you pursue narratives of retributive justice on their side. This is like having jail or having incredibly heavy fines. The reason why that's furthermore bad is because sending people to prison or heavily punishing them often does not do anything to actually alleviate their own circumstantial factors that have pushed them to commit those crimes in the first place. Rather, the first thing is just leaves a permanent mark on their record that makes people view them as criminals and therefore makes it less likely that job employers will see them as people who they can hire or give opportunities to. But secondly, you subject these ordinary people to the worst of conditions that are both brutal and inhumane within prison, as they also characterized you, leading to immense trauma or difficulty in accessing back into society, especially from the point in which you feel isolated from society because you've been in jail and you've been unable to like integrate with like other people or interact with other normal people of society to begin with. The way in here is very simple. Just on vulnerability, these individuals are often coerced into their own situation or into doing so by their own friends or just grow up into such environments, meaning it's not really a consented decision of theirs anyway. And they also face the most opportunity cost when faced with criminal charges or long sentences. This is also why the movement has to prioritize these individuals, considering these are the likely individuals who would not be able to have the capacity to advocate for large change on their own, and therefore it is the larger responsibility of the movement to also focus on those who are more vulnerable. Before I move on to my second point, I'll take a PY from closing if there are any.
Yeah, so over 25 years, the movement has reduced the incarcerated percentage by 4%. How historically has this been effective, and why can't we choose any other better methods of targeting?
I think the first thing to say is that even if it's true that like the number of people who are incarcerated hasn't been that much of a big drastic decrease either ways, we would still say that largely it isn't just about like who you incarcerate, but it's also about other efforts that have happened. So for example, the fact that there's so much more awareness around drug users right now, like we don't just see them as people who are solely criminals, but we recognize that certain circumstantial factors that push them to do so. So those kind of awareness campaigns have also occurred. We would also say things like the increase in rehabilitation programs, the increase in support programs to ensure
sure that these people have regained track into lives. We don't think that's the only metric to like justifying whether like there has been change or not. There are still other things that have happened. But the second thing I want to push is to why this is actually something that is justified or not. And the premise here is very simple. We know that there's a government responsibility in itself is that we prevent the government burden pushing. Note that a lot of characteristics identified in the first argument feed into explaining why the problem is often within the government's inability to protect the vulnerable and provide safe spaces for everyone. That's why we think that the burden itself cannot be placed on all drug users, just like how we do not prosecute the crime for like survival itself. That's why principally this historical change is already more justified. But we would say, like, let's take the trade-off that PM pushes with us, that we cannot help any other prisoners. Why is this still okay? Note that you just saying that the criminal justice system must be improved will never improve anything within itself. Spreading your resources so thin across all the issues across status quo is just inefficient and unstrategic way to use your resources and political capital. We would say that's far more worse for the movement as a whole for all reasons that I've been prouder to propose.
We thank the previous speaker for their remarks. We now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Here. Yep, just reiterating my POI preferences, which is that I would vastly prefer to take them across the diagonal and in chat. Do not verbally interrupt me in the middle of my speech. All right. Everybody ready? Okay, top shelf, seems to need a little bit more framing here. We are the criminal justice reform movement. This is indeed a This House Regrets retrospective motion. So we have a couple critical questions to answer. Has the criminal justice reform movement been successful at reforming criminal justice right now in the status quo? Have we actually seen a reduction in the prison population? And what do we, both principally and from a utilitarian metric, care about shifting our political capital? Is shifting our political capital to help nonviolent drug offenders been successful in the status quo? We would argue from the opening government side of the House that it absolutely historically has been a failure. A couple pieces of analysis and responses here. First, prison populations absolutely, as was poignantly pointed out by the POI, but is also just a genuine fact, have not reduced to any significant degree. Even though the fight for war on drugs, both sides agree, has been a success, and you are no longer sentenced very stiffly for merely having possession of marijuana or possession of opiates. Why then have we seen virtually zero success of the movement and zero success in getting these people out of prison? Because they're still forced into committing what we categorize as violent crimes, and they are no longer the golden angels that side opening opposition seeks to protect. Because if you are trapped in the social disease that is addiction, you are forced to steal so that you can get the next hit of something like an opiate. You are forced to turn against friends and family and commit not only petty theft, but directly steal the lockboxes and steal the wealth that you have out of your own household and out of your own community because you are trapped in the cycle of addiction. What we tell you is that their movement on their side of the house has created purely false solvency because there is no greater amount of people out of prisons than when we first started. And instead, this looks like politicians scoring easy W's by saying we are going to let all the people federally out of prison for marijuana, and then literally no one gets let out of prison because they're committing violent offenses. Let's make this even clearer. If you get arrested right now with marijuana in your back seat, you will get virtually zero sentence. You will maybe get arrested and you will be released on bond and you will be fine. If you get arrested with a gun, you will encounter virtually zero sentence. The reason that the American justice system is so insidious and what we've absolutely failed to solve is that if you get arrested with marijuana and a gun in the back of your car, you are facing literally like 20 to 30 years of a prison sentence because you are charged with distributing and you are charged with a felony where you have felony possession of a handgun and you are trapped permanently in prisons. This is the solvency that the movement completely failed to actually get people out of prisons retrospectively. How then the next burden that they put on us is to say, oh, well, the comparative is just that you demonize drug users, and if you try to actually solve the modern day slavery that exists in prisons, nobody would care. I have a couple responses to this. First, I think it's just principally important for us as the criminal justice reform movement that we actually engage in meaningful criminal justice reform. I think this is a pretty clear and intuitive argument. To the extent that we prove that the criminal justice reform has been a failure and has not gotten people out of prisons because it has not solved for the externalities that keep people locked in a retributive justice cycle as opposed to a restorative justice cycle. If we prove that there was even the most marginal percent chance that we implement a program that actually helps people escape addiction, as opposed to just letting them out when they take the opiates and being okay with the fact that they die, they likely don't get re-educated, and they're likely forced into violent crimes, at which point OO would simply stop defending about them and stop caring for them in the movement. I think it's really clear why this is principally bad, and we should push for meaningful reform, even if there is some probability it succeeds and some probability that it doesn't. But allow me to really crystallize the model here of what initiatives have actually worked to get human rights back to prisoners, even if they are violent, because I think this is really clear. This is what opening government's defending. And I think if we shifted a lot more political capital towards it, we would actually see people meaningfully able to re-educate themselves, account for the redlining and horrible oppression of Black and brown bodies in prisons right now, and actually create structural change. What does this look like? I think this looks like re-education programs in prisons. Note, you do not need any type of government cooperation with this to even make this succeed. There are dozens of programs right now where you read Shakespeare to people in prisons, where you help people in prisons study to attain their GEDs, to even move on to graduate school, to attain college educations and move to higher educations. We don't even need anyone to agree to this and co-opt with this. We can just spend the political capital that was completely unnecessary at getting people out of prisons and instead spend it on re-educating prisoners and making it so they have employable skills and can get out of society. This also creates a positive cascade where when programs are seen treating prisoners as human and prisoners are more likely to vote, more likely to re-enter society and to get jobs. If we had been doing this for the last 40 years, it would create a positive cascade where people are then more likely to hire felons and hire people who've been previously incarcerated because they're more employable. And if we've been doing this for the last 40 years, you create an extreme narrative shift and you very much get people out of poverty. What are other direct ways that the criminal justice movement could have been far more effective? Another one that immediately jumps to mind is California's willingness to let prisoners actually get fairly compromised for their labor. Again, I think this is something we principally care about as the criminal justice reform movement that we have woefully neglected. The fact that right now, if you are in prisons, you are legally still a slave under the Constitution and can be paid not only $0 for your labor, but more often you are paid an extremely low amount for your labor and just forced to do laundry in prisons. Now, if you are a firefighter in California and you still are incarcerated, you can actually go get labor, you can re-enter society, and we actually restore prisoners as opposed to treating them retributively. I'll take a POI, preferably across the diagonal if they have one. Okay, no POI. I'll take one from opening up as well, if they have one. 3.
Risk over time. So obviously, just because the statistics say that there's not much of a difference doesn't mean that we're actually not prosecuting as much people.
Okay, but you're completely ignoring my argument, which is that you were stopping prosecuting them for the physical possession of the marijuana. You just pretend that they were distributing the marijuana because they had a gun in their backseat as well. That is why whenever we pardoned all the prisoners, they did actually let them out of prison, because the disease that is addiction forces you to steal, to rob people, to engage in violent crime and historically underfunded narratives to actually subsist your addiction. And since we don't humanize prisoners in the status quo, and we spent virtually no political capital doing it, we've failed as a movement. I think the weighing here is really clear. One, this is principally important for us, and thus in the closing half of this debate and also against opening up, I think we just win off that. 2, even just being utilitarian, I think this is a vastly preferable way to spend my resources as the criminal justice movement, because it has shown we do not need any type of government intervention to actually re-educate prisoners and bring them back into the fold and humanize them. It creates a positive cascade where we continue to do it. We have no idea what the world would look like had we actually efficiently used our resources. We just know that it has not helped people get out of prisons right now, because addiction, being stuck in that cycle, makes you a violent offender, and we have no sympathy for those right now in America due to the failings of our criminal justice reform movement. For that reason, really proud to propose. Thank you.
We thank the previous speaker for their remarks. We now welcome the deputy leader of opposition to end the closing half, to end the opening half.
Okay. If I'm both audible and visible, I'm going to be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. At the top of my speech, I want to point 2 things out. First, note the entire case shift from PM, because PM literally tells you that you should not be caring about drug users right now. And the likely alternative is that you're able to care about the entire criminal justice system as a whole. While second speaker suddenly just comes up and says that, no, we should be caring about drug addicts, but it's just we should be caring about the violent drug addicts, because that's a problem that exists within the current criminal justice system, and it's ineffective. Note that this is on a completely different premise, and therefore they just kind of drop their first speaker's arguments, which I'll be responding to later anyway. But also second, OJ's entire positive case relies on the CJS reform movement having lots of support and capital, which they do not prove. What we would prefer is that you start with smaller change and a smaller stakeholder, and then you can build your way up to after your first win. So we outweigh them on probability and tangible outcomes. But anyways, the counterfactual, the reason why the counterfactual that they proposed to you, that we're able to care, or we're able to fix like all the problems within the status quo, within the criminal justice system, it's unlikely, is because first, the likely counterfactual is the demonization of drug users as a whole, not the drug itself. Note that the reason for emphasis on nonviolent drug offenders was because of the war on drugs narrative and a lot of societal discussion surrounding drugs. So the gut bench cannot come up to this debate claiming a counterfactual with a different group of offenders. The emphasis will still be around drugs to a certain extent, and you just saying violent offenders isn't going to be that likely to prove or to convince people anyway, because people obviously have the strongest stereotype against violent offenders. But also second, if the direction then wasn't to reduce the sentences for these groups, it would have likely been in the opposite direction, because a lot of people are shaken by the situation. This looks like stronger hatred on drug users, taboo against rehab and therapy, and so on, that actively stops people from being able to save lives. Firstly, then, I'm going to talk about care for drug-related violence and why we're far better for this. But also, secondly, on the method of the CJS, why we're much more justified. First, let's talk about the care for drug-related violence. So the first claim that they give us is that we're ineffective. 3 levels of response. First, crime has risen in general, so you cannot just say that because the percentage number is not that different, it's largely different. Plus, you also characterize that if I have marijuana in my trunk, I will not go to jail. That sounds like effective change to me, because I definitely had a stronger sentence in 1998. I'll take you a bit later. Second, if there are dozens of educational programs right now, exactly as DPM characterizes you, literally, why do you need to regret the movement? Because that just shows that both are co-optable. There are changes that you can make at the same time while spending a lot of political capital into trying to help these non-violent offenders. But note that even if we were to focus on educational programs, it's still done far better under our rule, because movements like these is what humanizes and shows that not all criminals are horrible. You defending a violent offender is just intuitively harder, because a lot of people don't opt into the narrative that someone who holds a gun and will shoot people while they're under the influence of a drug is someone that you should forgive and you should enter back into society. Well, on the other hand, if you just frame them as a teenager who was coerced by their friends or peer pressured into using drugs, you're much more likely to forgive them, or to make sure, or to believe that not all criminals are necessarily the fault of their individual choice, but more on the fault of their environment, which is why the first step is to first focus on the non-violent offenders that most of the public can intuitively opt into. Third, if the reason why you claim this is horrible is gun versus marijuana versus just gun, or having just marijuana, that's a problem with the wrong weighing of evidence, because me just having a gun and marijuana in the back of my trunk should never prove anything, because it's just possession. So clearly that's a problem that exists within gut bench as well. But also note that even if it's not true, what government side looks at is that people with just marijuana get 20 years, people with marijuana and a gun get 22 years. So at the end, they don't save or they don't help anyone anyway, because you still continue the narrative that people with drugs should be demonized as a whole, and no one ups into the narrative that the violent drug offenders should be forgiven, because those are the people that society in general sees as problematic and dangerous. Wait, then, why are we exclusive in the help that we're able to provide? Note that the social perception is a large part of the movement, not only on the actual punishment, but also how people see drug users. Rehabilitation for drug users is usually done by slowly decreasing dependence by using drugs or using counter substances, meaning that it's a tedious process requiring funding or decreased stigma, so people will reach out. If you first claim that you want to provide these services, or you want to, like, the way you do it is like by decreasing the amount of substance you use, right? If you say that you're going to give this to violent drug offenders, people will still always inherently be worried for their safety about what if even if it's a smaller dosage, they are willing to, or they're likely to turn violent again. On government, recidivism for these drug offenses or just crime rates in general will never decrease, because you don't provide them a way to get out. Getting lighter punishments or more rehabilitative punishments, and lightening the strict laws around non-violent drug offense in general, or potentially even legalizing certain more recreational drugs, is something that is exclusively possible under our rule, because you don't group all violent drug users within a whole. Note that this is irreversible, because this type of care, such as you decreasing the dosage, is likely to save lives, but only happens once you actually have the immense or the same amount of opt-in that we characterize you or mechanize you starting, Hannah. Before I go on, I'll take a PR if there's any.
You tell me that the fact that prisons are still increasing in populations despite your efforts isn't pertinent because crime itself is increasing. How well is our criminal justice system functioning, and what reform does it need if criminals keep having to do crimes?
Okay, the most that you proved to me through that POI is that this movement in general is not powerful. Then, even if we were to take this under your side, let's say you were able to support whatever you want, even though that's clearly not going to be the likely counterfactual, it's still not going to be effective. It just has to do with like resource allocation. If this group is something that a lot of public don't opt into, even though we try our best to frame them as the vulnerable individuals, just note how much people will furthermore not be willing to opt into your world where you're not even framing them as vulnerable individuals, when you no longer can say, oh, they're still innocent because they haven't harmed anyone, because they have harmed people. They have actively taken a gun and shot at other people under the influence of a drug. Those are exactly the people that we are unable to defend under our world, which is why we take the first step for non-violent offenders. But secondly, under criminal justice system, notice a direct threat of placing non-violent offenders and violent offenders together, whether it is within crime or whether it is within punishment, is that you prevent the systemic improvement of those same neighborhoods and communities which harm the most vulnerable. The more you prevent drug offenders from being able to integrate back into society after their term is over, the more you expose them to being influenced by the worst prisoners, which is why, even if it means that we like under there where you're able to like proportionally decrease both sentences of violence and non-violent offenders, that's still something that is marginally worse than our side, where we're able to significantly decrease the sentences the non-violent offenders have to go through, because now non-violent offenders are no longer seen in the same category of criminals or in the same category of offenders as the rest of society perceives them. So at least for these individuals that have been structurally discriminated by the environment that they were placed into, we still allow them to reintegrate within society, and we prevent them from having to go through processes like recidivism that in the end are more likely to bring them to the case of becoming a violent offender. When we tell you that we prevent more violent crime, we're very proud to stand on team, very proud to oppose.
We thank the previous speaker for that speech. We now welcome the member of government. Here.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Cool. And I prefer POIs in chat or visually. Okay. Time begins with in 3, 2, 1. The problem with OG is, as OO identifies, they just think they can trade off one form of drug reform for just prison reform as a whole. But although OO points this out correctly, they themselves have the same problem, as they seem to think you can just replace rehabilitative and empathetic advocacy for just harsh and unsympathetic ones in the counterfactual. What we're going to do on closing is we're going to take the more realistic burden, actually explain to you what kinds of drug offenders will be focused on, why, and also why that's better for society as a whole. First thing to tackle in the extension then, what is the counterfactual? I think it's pretty obviously violent drug offenders. And the reason for this, I didn't actually think I needed to explain, to be honest, was that if you look at the goals as to why people currently target non-violent drug offenders, because they're easy to advocate for, because they target certain actors, and all for the purpose of like making society safer from drugs. I think the most realistic counterfactual is one where you just have different incentives, but still maintain the purpose of making society safer for drugs. Therefore, you target other actors in different ways, and most reasonably and most opposite from that is violent drug offenders. But what does this actually look like then, with that out of the way? I think non-violent drug offenders, as opening half concedes, are almost exclusively drug users. And the reason is just because this is like the least dangerous and competitive rule within the ring of drug distribution and use. And so what actors will focus on instead? They look like the distributors of drugs. These look like large cartels that sell dangerous drugs on the street. This is like unlicensed companies that are distributing addictive medicine. This looks like big pharma companies that are intentionally overprescribing drugs. These, I think, are all quite violent drug offenders, not only because oftentimes it's just directly more violent, but also because they enable harm more directly. And therefore, I think, they're probably the most opposite actor they count. What would this advocacy actually look like then? Note that criminal justice advocacy does not have to be promoting leniency at either side of the house. I think instead what it has to do is like promote a change and make a difference, right? Given the status of what these distributors and what their relationship with the criminal justice system looks like, the most likely form of reform is one where you have more crackdowns on distributors. So this could look like advocating for more blame on companies, harsher sentences and penalties, and also just like more investigations into potentially corrupt companies, for example, or potentially dangerous cartels. That's what we think is the most likely counterfactual on our side of the house. With that being said then, into the main meat of the extension, why is this counterfactual actually more effective at protecting society than the status quo? Because I will note it's pretty, if you just look at the info side, Office has been pretty ineffective so far. Like, it took like decades for you to reduce the incarceration rate by 4%. We think we can do better. The main mechanism here, I'm actually going to flip OO's entire case. I would say, first of all, oftentimes placing a brighter spotlight on things like on people like teenagers and minorities oftentimes creates more backlash from the broader public for multiple reasons. First of all, when you target like drug users and when you target like drug users that aren't violent, and then, well, what a coincidence, the most policed areas happen to be Black communities, what you actually do is perpetuate stereotypes, for example, that like Black communities are just drug users, minorities are more likely to be bad people as a whole. But second of all, though, note that individual citizens on the ground, unrelated to criminal justice reform movements, are usually quite negatively biased and harsh on crime because they're very scared that themselves or their family is going to be impacted one day. And if they just overall, their view on crime is usually just like more retributive and more like harsh, basically. And so what that means is it's extremely difficult to take these people and try to promote like a very sympathetic stance to be like, look, these are minorities and children, even though, but they're, and so therefore we should be like very empathetic and not as harsh on them, because even though they are minorities and children, I think people are still quite negatively biased. They blame the adults instead. They say like, oh, these children are bad because their parents taught them to use drugs. That's still overall negative towards this community as a whole. Instead, it's just comparatively easier in our side of the house when you can actually capitalize on their anger and fear that they already and inevitably will continue to have, and instead push for harder crackdowns but on different actors. That's when you get like basically the same impact, but it's just more effective and less likely to actually lead to more stigma stereotypes against minorities. Before I continue, I'll take the point.
If you demonize cartels without constructing a narrative defending drug users, why wouldn't this harm all drug users as a whole? Because you don't make the differentiation clear.
Yeah, so the distinction here is in the word focus in the motion. I think that's a distinction. Inevitably, if you put all the blame, if you try to put all the blame and responsibility onto companies, obviously that puts less blame and responsibility on the individual users. When all the media reports aren't just, look, we have another group of minorities that are using drugs, but it's instead, here are the tactics that these companies are using to try to get you to be addicted. Obviously, that takes less blame off of the individual users that inevitably get addicted. I think we basically co-opt all of your benefits, but I'm going to explain that further here. So what are the various impacts from our extension? Number one, I think you just get more and better crackdowns. The point at which this advocacy is actually effective or more likely to be effective is the prerequisite to actual change in the criminal justice system. And so if all the things I told you before manifest to a larger degree, we could have actually like made quite a big impact within the last 25 years. Because if you think about it, in the decades where this motion actually takes place, we saw like the peak of crack distribution. We saw the peak of pharma companies pushing heroin onto people's lives. And so if we could have mitigated that, that's like a really big impact, because these drugs, as opening concedes, literally ruined the lives of thousands of people. Second impact, I think our impact is have carryover benefits to opt, right? Like I said before in answer to the POI, if you play up the fault of the distributors and people as a whole, obviously you put less blame on the users, because you can't say like, if like the media narrative switches to one where it's like, oh, here are all the tactics these companies use, they target the vulnerable and then they get them addicted onto drugs, obviously less blame gets put on the individual people as well. But second of all, though, I think we can actually co-opt some of OG's claims here as well, because the reason why prison reform is so hard is because the people that you put in it so far are a lot of minorities and people who have no political sway. The point at which like rich and privileged companies and individuals are now the ones in prison, or at least engaging more with the criminal justice system. I think now they care more about whether prison is comfortable, whether whether there's more violence in prison. I think we co-opt that as well. Third impact, though, I just think we have the case most exclusive to the drug issue. Like, I think the issues of like minorities and teenagers, this is outweighing OG, by the way, using drugs are going to be positively impacted by other types of movements and reforms as a whole, such as like prison reform as a whole, which probably exists extraneous, and like education reforms about teaching kids about drugs in school, stuff like that. But lastly, though, I think we just increase trust between minorities and the government, and know how important this actually is, because minority distrust of the health industry, for example, caused many minorities to abstain from getting the vaccine during the COVID pandemic. The fact that minorities distrust the police means that they don't call for help when their lives are literally in danger. But if we can take one step, we can bring them one step closer to not distrusting the criminal justice system and being able to use it more to benefit their lives, is probably enough for us to take the win. All those reasons we're proud to propose.
We thank the previous speaker for their remarks. We now welcome the member of opposition. Hear, hear.
Okay. Please, POIs verbally. I'm like in a different window, so if you put it in the chat, I'm not going to see it. We'll begin in 3, 2, 1. So I think there's some buzzwords that are being thrown around in this debate, but no one's actually contextualized it. Everyone says this movement has limited capital, but no one's told you why. This movement is entirely decentralized and is usually representative of Black and Brown people advocating for their own communities and advocating for what are often their brothers, their sisters, their mothers, their fathers. This is the exact reason why most of the arguments you've heard so far will fall pretty flat. First, with OG. All of the problems that OG have mentioned are great and all, but they should take it up with Biden. But like, how the hell do you want ordinary people who want to have some level of impact to actually have some, to actually conceptualize and implement the things that they're talking about? The lack of empathy that they're talking about has nothing to do with the movement itself, but rather the nature of how people express any level of compassion for people that don't look like them or live in the same neighborhoods as them. This movement has been able to bring attention to things in the forms of things like Netflix documentaries, racial murals, art, whatever it manifests in more ordinary ways. But also the fact that so many people in this debate as non-Black and Brown people know the nuances of the challenges that come in prison through books like Just Mercy or through like narratives of these things that are part of this decentralized movement is demonstrative of how successful the movement has been on centering the voices of minorities as we advocate for our own communities. Likewise, the issue that occurs with closing government is that because of the decentralized nature of the movement, it is incredibly difficult for communities who everyone thus far has acknowledged typically are of lower income backgrounds to sue corporations or to have take any level of legal action against these corporations, and as if somehow a singular movement is why minorities don't trust the police when there are literal gangs in these communities that serve as like a pseudo local police. These issues are deeper than like a movement itself, but rather that's the reason why there isn't that necessary political capital. So what are we telling you? We tell you that this is going to be good for groups of people both in and out of prison. Firstly, taxpayers. It is going to be good for taxpayers because it's going to reveal to people how inefficient, it has revealed to people how inefficient and how for-profit the system is. Most people don't understand that their taxes are going towards their state and federal taxes are going towards funding for-profit prisons who often solicit government services to house and care for inmates. These companies often charge taxpayers for each inmate they house, creating a financial incentive to keep facilities at full capacity. These types of rhetorics have been exposed recently through these movements, but also inmates themselves are often required to pay fees associated with their imprisonment, such as fees for like phone calls or medical care. And like the families of inmates may also be required to pay for certain expenses. Taxpayers bear the brunt of these costs. And whether those state and federal taxes, as there's been more scrutiny on the movement, these people have been able to say, hey, why the hell is my money going towards a for-profit system? And as a result, these more efficient public finance programs have meant that states like California, Massachusetts, and all over the United States, like even local levels as well, have been able to move this money into more social support programs that are already being pushed to the brim, like Social Security or pension. So you're able to impact people outside of prison, taxpayers. Just on impact alone, that is way more people in the United States than are incarcerated, right? But like, secondly, you're able to impact all people who are incarcerated because progress for one is progress for all. Simply speaking, any level of attention you put on a movement is going to create momentum for other offenders. It's so important to note that this is absolutely not how the OG wants to frame it, as in this house as motion. Specifically, we're saying when you talk about creating momentum or a ripple effect, if you will, it's so important to understand that as you put attention on nonviolent drug offenders, regardless of how successful they are, people become more distrustful of a system that they've historically been told works. And why is this likely going to be has been more effective? Because these movements tend to be grassroots, i.e. these NGOs, these nonprofits, these community organizers are integrated into their local neighborhoods. So this looks like, rather than what OG tries to tell you about Biden citing some grand law that affects the entire United States, this looks like someone going to like, if you're a Santa Clara County resident, for example, going to the Santa Clara County Police Department and demanding for change that happens on a local level at a decentralized level as well. This has also brought inspiration to large social movements like Black Lives Matter and like other like police reform as a whole. Thirdly, criminal justice reform that focuses on non-violent drug offenses has sent the message that drug addiction is a public health issue, not just a criminal issue. This has led to greater investment in drug treatment and rehabilitation programs, as has been conceded by pretty much every team thus far, that has been more effective in addressing drug addiction and reducing drug-related crime, which we know empirically to be true from the info side. But also, not only does this positively impact people who are addicted to drugs in prisons, it positively impacts drug addicts outside of prisons. And it's exactly why the state of California, for example, has created programs that now that require insurance to cover mental health care for people with addictions. But this is entirely because we've shifted the conversation around what was the war on drugs and how we associated crime with drugs, but rather that drug addiction is a mental health, public health issue. And this has been far more effective in engaging people, yes, but also in making sure that people have access to the resources that they need. Any POIs?
Yes, POI across the diagonal from OG. It's really unclear to me why I should humanize only one small set of the prison population at a time, as opposed to using the political capital that we've had for the last 40 years
So
towards
answer
things like
this
prison
pretty well,
suffrage
right?
and higher
People
education.
don't tend to empathize with people that they don't understand, right? So like if you live in your white picket fence, you're a white middle-class family, it's pretty hard for you to empathize with the Black kid from Chicago. However, who is best able to advocate for that kid from Chicago is the people in their neighborhoods. That's how you galvanize change. It's at the point at which people in your own neighborhoods have the guts, have the capital, and have the resources to stand up for you that you're able to advocate for people who have historically been wrongfully incarcerated, over policed, over profiled. These are the ways you're able to access this change. It's not by getting a white president, a white man, to advocate for communities he doesn't even understand himself. So absolutely, you're more intuitively going to have better representation on our side of the movement because you're able to get that change going. So on the point of we outweigh our own OO because we have higher impact, right? They've limited this impact to just non-violent drug offenders, but we tell you that taxpayers are going to benefit, violent drug offenders are going to benefit, and people who may be addicted to drugs outside of the prison system are also going to benefit. This system is an ecosystem at large, and it props and creates social justice and social equity as a larger conversation in the national consciousness of the entire country. And for that reason, we're so proud to oppose.
We thank the previous speaker for their remarks. We now welcome the government whip. Hear, hear.
Cool. You guys can hear me?
Yes.
POIs in chat. Both opposition teams in this debate foolishly misidentify the problem. The problem in the past 30 years is not the fact that people used heroin and OD'd on the streets, but the fact is that pharma companies pushed this heroin to millions of Americans in middle America. It's the fact that they overprescribed it to people as a use for a painkiller. The fact that they sold it without a license. The fact that they fabricated credentials and used medical officials paying them off to say that it wasn't harmful, ultimately killing hundreds of thousands of people in middle America. That was the problem that both opposition teams needed to solve in this debate. They did not do that by targeting the wrong actors. I'll go team by team. First, I'll talk about opening government. I think every other team agrees that opening government, unfortunately, did not really debate the motion. In a debate, if you have a motion like this House would fund national parks, opening opposition can't counter model and say, we're going to take the money used to fund national parks and put it into welfare instead. That's not how debating works. Fiat needs to be transferable. And I think opening opposition is correct in identifying that the political will that came out of the failure that was the war on drugs manifests itself in allowing this movement to advocate for drug reform. That is specifically drug reform related to the harm to victims of drug crimes, not broad-scale prison reform, not deleting the prison industrial complex. We had to take the realistic stance. Closing opposition then. I genuinely don't really understand this extension on taxpayers. We're not disagreeing that the movement should draw attention and should garner support for this causes, but it doesn't matter if this movement is decentralized or if it is centralized. I would posit that taxpayers who see their communities being ravaged by the effects of the crack epidemic in the 90s, the opioid epidemic in 2000s, being destroyed by drug-related crimes, probably care about reform on either side of the house. That's to say we can galvanize the same support that they do. We just use it better. The third team in this debate I want to deal with is opening opposition. Now, opening opposition pushes in their speeches that our counterfactual has to be demonizing the victims of drug crimes instead of reducing their sentences. That's not true. Think about 30 years ago, what the movement for criminal justice reform probably would have advocated for instead. We can focus on the distributor of the drugs, not the uses of those drugs, because those distributors should also be penalized and held to standards of account. Instead of, for example, having criminal justice for those who use the drugs, we focus on the gangs and cartels that supply the drugs and use violent mechanisms. Those are the gangs and cartels that use violence to suppress local communities, to beat out other cartels that actually cause violence in the streets. We can prosecute those people. We can also prosecute large pharma companies who indirectly commit violence on the people to which it pushes its product, to the people who which it uses fraud to say that, for example, its products are not dangerous, to fabricate medical information, to have credentials that they actually don't have. We can crack down on those corporations, the ones that operate without a license, the cartels that operate with means of violence, and we can get those people prosecuted. It's only when we bring those actors to justice that we can actually serve the root cause of the problem, because they were the ones that were distributing the drugs. It's not the point that, for example, people got addicted to drugs in the 1990s or the 2000s, and it was their fault that they overdosed, but it was the problem that cartels and corporations pushed those drugs onto them in a predatory way. If we can get rid of that exploitative nature of what happened nearly 30 years ago in America, we would have been able to solve the problem much better. The final thing they say is a principle. This principle is quite philosophically inconsistent because notably, this motion implies a trade-off. That also comes at the expense of the victims of violent drug users, so they had to contend with that trade-off. On solvency, there is solvency on our side as well. You can destigmatize people on our side as well, but the bottom line is that their side has reduced the rate of incarceration by 4% in 25 years. That is not enough. That is a failure to the communities that these movements had to help. Before I move on, opening. Closing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Good.
So
Hello.
Just go.
What exactly would a social movement that goes up against big pharma actually look like?
Advocating for the leaders to be, prosecuted, advocating for medical practitioners to actually have a license, advocating for them to not overprescribe drugs that are harmful. Our extension, we are not like opening government who focuses on deleting the entire prison industrial complex, but we actually focus on the root causes. We focus on the distributors, we focus on pharma companies, we push accountability for those distributors and much harsher punishments on them. This means accountability for them who are the root cause of the problems. It means failures on parts of the government to address gangs and distributors of crack in the 1980s when the Reagan administration and the Nixon administration turned blind eyes to that. It means restrictions on pharma companies who falsified information and falsified medical documents to say that that was only revealed like 40 years later that was fraudulent, whereas on our side of the house, we were able to push that fraudulence nearly 30, 20 years ago. 3 impacts that we've given from Jiao's extension that don't really get much refutation from closing opposition. All closing opposition really says is, oh, you can't sue companies because the communities are poor. Well, this is still collective action on their side. We can still hold the governments and politicians and senators to account who neglected these Black and brown communities 30 years ago. 3 impacts that we've given from our extension that get no refutation. Number 1, it's much more effective change. It's no longer a 4% decrease over 25 years. We can actually solve the root problem. That's to say, we can hold Purdue Pharma to account when they pushed OxyContin and heroin to people on the streets. We can hold to account the cartels who, for example, sold drugs that were marketed as heroin but spiked with fentanyl instead. We would say that's probably a perfectly reasonable interpretation of what it means to be a violent drug offender when the drugs that you were selling to people are spiked and actually end up causing them to overdose. Number 2, it gains support for minority communities, because what happens on their side is you push unjust stereotypes onto Black and brown communities. The perception from most of the majority of the nation is the fact that these communities are the ones committing all the drug crime, that they're all addicts, but we fix that stereotype on our side. You fix the fact that the crack epidemic ravaged Black America in the 80s and that the Reagan administration turned a blind eye to that. You fix the fact that the opioid epidemic targeted poor and lower class families in middle American states like Illinois and Ohio, which they also neglect on their side. Maybe you can sort of reduce the drug punishments for people who are caught with marijuana in their car. But on our side of the house, nearly 30 years ago, we could have fixed the root cause of the problem. We could have made the governments pay more attention to the communities that were actually being destroyed. We could have made the government pay more attention to the pharma companies that were pushing dangerous, poisonous drugs onto our people. But number 3, finally, on trust. And there's 3 pillars of trust that we identify. 1, on governance. The fact that Black, brown, and Latino communities have structurally less trust in those communities when their neighborhoods were neglected. This leads to political apathy. This leads to them voting in bad political leaders. Number 2, on the police, because you antagonize the police to the extent where you don't actually fix the root problem. The fact that there's now distrust for the police in minority communities because they were over policed, because the minorities communities were over-militarized, that means people die because of police brutality. People die in scuffles between the police and everyday civilians. Number three, on healthcare, you get more trust for the government and you get more trust for systems of healthcare. Jiao identifies to you the reason why a lot of Black and brown communities, and especially lower income communities, did not take the COVID vaccine is because they didn't trust the governments at that time. They didn't think the healthcare system had their best interest in mind. They didn't see people with the same skin color as them being represented like that. And the weighing of this is so abundantly simple. We actually solve the right actors. We provide help to the people who actually deserved it, and we made sure that the actors who actually caused all this instability were brought to account. Look, for 25 years, the criminal justice system has utterly failed victims of drug crime. On closing government, we don't focus on the victim, we focus on the perpetrator. We are very proud to propose.
We thank the previous speaker for their remarks. We now welcome the opposition whip to end today's debate. Hear, hear.
All right. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
A reminder that I would like to take POIs in the chat. Please do not interrupt. Okay. Closing government says that they're confused by our extension on taxpayers and the ripple effect and all that. So let me re-explain it for them. What we're explaining to you here is that just like opening opposition was starting to explain, there is the fact that they try and tell you that as the movement builds more momentum, it's going to potentially be more effective in the long run and that sort of thing. But they don't mechanize that in any way. And they also were not quite able to explain why, even though the movement hasn't been super successfully in numbers from like 24% to 20%, why it's successful. We're able to come in and fill those gaps by explaining to you the actual mechanization for how that works in two distinct ways. The first is that if it's a decentralized movement, as Dylan explains to you, where it's Black and brown bodies advocating for themselves, for their families, and for that sort of thing, then you're going to see that these people become more engaged with the process as they see that, for example, their brother was incarcerated for like 10 years for owning an ounce of marijuana and never did anything violent. They become engaged with the system. They become critical of the system where beforehand they might not have ever been. And then they become more willing to talk to their neighbors and build a grassroots movement to start to advocate for change, which is what this movement actually was. That is the uniqueness of why the decentralized movement is able to have political capital about something that's easy to relate about, such as like the nonviolent drug offenses, and why even though it wasn't successful, it builds a ripple effect because people become critical of the justice system as a whole. Instead of just thinking to themselves, the criminal justice system is bad because of the nonviolent drug offenses, they become critical of it on the whole and instead are able to question other things, such as all of the laundry list of human rights that opening government tries to give you. Hopefully that clarifies. Let's explain a little bit more on opening government in particular. First, a couple of issues. They don't characterize how the movement works whatsoever. And importantly, that means that they get themselves into a bind when they try and talk about political capital. On top of that, they're not able to explain why, for example, or explain the other good changes that have occurred that have started to make progress towards the laundry list of items.
OG.
Later, I'm taking them in the chat. One of the ways that this has improved has been through Black Lives Matter, for example, and police reform across the country. There's also been far less executions. Parole is tended to be granted earlier. There's far less solitary confinement. There are more rehab programs. All of this is true compared to 25 years ago, and they're not able to explain why any of that works in their world. They also try and tell you that drug sentencing is minimal now. First of all, this is blatantly untrue. Second of all, it still adds to the length of stay of people. By getting rid of that sentencing, we still reduce the amount of time that people spend in prison and thus reduce the cost to the taxpayers, which is absolutely critical. We also see, for example, that the marijuana and Biden situation that they talk about is not a fair example of the world that we're debating, which is not just marijuana, but all of the drugs have nonviolent reforms. I'll take opening government.
So the squirreling of our case has gotten a little out of control. Both closing teams criticize us for overusing fiat when we tell you that we're going to humanize prisoners directly with programs such as re-education in prisons, voter suffrage, etc. Can you maybe explain specifically what your movement looks like, as that's been incredibly unclear to me?
Yeah, our movement looks like what happened because this is this house regrets. So we get to argue that what happened is what should have happened. You're the one who has the burden of trying to flesh out how the movement would actually get to all of that laundry list of reforms you said without any potential political capital that you were able to mechanize, which I think is your burden to prove and not mine. So on opening opposition, I've already explained some of the limits of their case and how we build on it by explaining how the movement is decentralized and what it means to get people to critically engage with the system as a whole instead of just relying on success success. That's how we get past their burden where their struggle with proving whether the movement was effective or not. On closing government, let's spend some time here. They tell you that the problem is social addiction, and that we should have prosecuted the cartels to get rid of the roots. Several things here. First of all, the cartels were prosecuted in the war on drugs. There was the kingpin strategy, there was the wipeout strategy, Pablo Escobar was hunted down, and on top of that, there was a general public mistrust of big pharma as the opioid crisis got worse. This has happened already in our world, but you see that it wasn't very effective because it wasn't able to build the kind of grassroots movement that you get on our side of the house when you focus on the neighbors and the people that you want and start building that critical mistrust from the ground up. Instead, and they also, it's pretty bizarre to just come in and say that like the counterfactual would have been prosecuting cartels and big pharma. They don't provide any reason as to how a movement, which is historically focused on limiting the length of stay of prisoners, would instead suddenly spin to trying to incarcerate more people for longer periods of time and punish people worse. That's completely counterintuitive to what the movement would actually do. And panel, you should put the burden solidly on them to come up with a reason as to why the movement would swing in such the opposite direction. They also try and tell you, for example, that even if you buy that the movement would have swung to try and prosecute those cartels, please keep in mind that this is not necessarily a successful strategy. The first is that these cartels and big pharma have tons and tons of money. They have lots and lots of lobbying power. You're not going to be able to have a very successful prosecution or campaign against them. And on top of that, as Dylan, I think, brings up in POI, what exactly are you going to prosecute the leaders of big pharma for? It's difficult to say, oh, you guys have been selling these drugs which were approved by the FDA to people. No, like it's extremely difficult to do that. You would have to go down to every single doctor all along the way. There's simply not the political time or will to do that. And they would have to really struggle to come up with a reason as to why that would be the case. On top of that, let's go ahead and have a quick recap of our case and an explanation of Wang. Remember that the movement is decentralized, which is where we get our critical extension off of the top half. And also that is where we see our impacts for taxpayers, which far outweighs anything else brought up in this round. Everybody else has focused solely on the criminals involved. We are able to explain how it impacts the entire United States. That's a key extension on our closing opposition, where we're explaining to you that as people are removed from prison or stay in prison less often, especially with the increasing ripple effects, you're instead able to move money into more social services, as has already happened in California and Massachusetts, which is going to mean that more and more people are better able to avoid the things that would push them into the social addiction problem that closing government talks about in the first place, which is how we're able to co-opt their impacts there. Then, on the ripple effect, once again, we agree with opening government on their characterization of the motion as a this house as, it's actually regrets, that's wrong. But even if we were to read it that way, it would still have been more successful from the movement's perspective to continue focusing on nonviolent drug reform because it's easier to win other political allies, get media coverage of people that are viewed as more innocent, and it's also easier for people to become critical of the criminal justice system when they think that their brother did nothing wrong as compared to trying to defend rapists or something like that. There's also the public health optics and the absolute principle of the fact that it's important to keep people's choice protected, which is part of what contributes to the ripple effect and allows for more critical engagement with the system on the whole. That is why we are proud to oppose.